Gonna do something a little bit different today. In addition to the dash cam footage that I usually put up, I'm also gonna talk about, share some of my thoughts and try to debunk some myths and just tell some fairly shocking statistics that paint quite a picture about this situation in Baltimore and many other cities across the country. So the dash cam footage that we're looking at today comes out of West Baltimore, primarily the Edmondson Avenue area, so in the southern part of the west side of Baltimore. So the first thing I want to bring some attention to is just the sheer amount of violence that happens in the city of Baltimore. Since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan started in the early 2000s, there's been more murders in the city of Baltimore than in the number of servicemen and women killed in either one of those countries. Now, that's pretty shocking considering that these were both literal war zones and entire countries, whereas the city of Baltimore is in one of the richest states in the country and is only 90 square miles. So the second part that I want to talk about is the city of Baltimore's police department. The common refrain is that they're underfunded and understaffed. That's totally ridiculous. They're incompetent, and there's no way around it. I'm not one of these anti-police people, but the city of Baltimore's police department is remarkably incompetent. They, in the year 2020, were the most well-funded police department in the country. Despite this, the city of Baltimore was one of the most violent cities in the country, as usual. The next thing I want to kind of piggybacking along this subject is the homicide clearance rate. In the early 2010s, the rate was around 50%, which is not great, but pretty standard for violent American cities. Then in 2015, following the Freddie Gray riots, it dropped down to 28%. Now it's floated around in the 20s, 30s, and 40s percentages over the last 5 years. This is incredibly bad, and it's just a green light for anybody who wants to commit violence, knowing that they probably won't have to face the consequences, because not only do they not have to worry about court, they won't ever even see court, because the police won't even find a suspect in their case. Another thing to note is when they say that the homicide clearance rate is 35 or 40%, a big chunk of this 35 or 40% are what they call cleared by exception, which is generally when a case is cleared by exception, what that means is that the primary suspect in the case themselves were murdered. So you're talking about 35% clearance rates, and that's not even 35% of the time that they bring a suspect to court. A lot of time of that 35% of the time, the case is cleared because the suspect himself is dead. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about, the training academy. Recently, this was a year or two back, there was a legal professional who was involved in training the recruits who said that 1/3 of all the graduating recruits the day before the gun and badge ceremony, and this is a quote, lacked basic understanding of laws governing constitutional policing. Now, they said ultimately these 1/3 of recruits did pass the required test, but not until after the legal expert who was raising this issue was removed from training. So that seems a little suspect. But another thing with new recruits, and this is common to many police departments, but particularly an issue in the city of Baltimore, is that 15 to 20% of their new officers resign in their first year. This is obviously not a good sign when you spend all this money, time, and effort training somebody only to have them immediately resign. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is the police department staffing issues. So they always talk about there's not enough police, there's not enough police, there's not enough police. But the thing is, there are enough police. They don't schedule them well. There was a staffing study done in 2018 that looked at how police were scheduled and how their time was being used. There were times where the police were scheduled with the department knowing that there wouldn't be enough police to even respond to calls for service. Now, standard in the industry is to have about 60 to 70% of police officers' time dedicated to responding to calls for service, with the rest of the time being for things like proactive policing and shift change and all these other things. So when the city of Baltimore schedules a shift, knowing that there will be times when they don't even have enough to cover the calls for service, that's a problem. It's even more of a problem when there's other times where they may only have 20 or 30 or 40% of their officers' time being used up with calls for service. So ultimately, this is a result of contractual obligations with the police unions and with deals that have been made. So by limiting the flexibility of scheduling, they're creating a problem that doesn't need to be there. If they were able to have more flexibility with how they deploy their staffing, they would have a much better time responding to all calls, and you wouldn't have things like 15-minute response times for priority 1 calls. So I'm rambling at this point, so I'm gonna call it here, but just wanted to give my thoughts, and this is not an indictment of every officer in the police department, but it's an indictment of how the police department's being run. I'm sure there are some good officers with good intentions, but as a whole, the police leadership, the political leadership, and even other parts loosely connected to the police, like the state's attorney,